The floor is yours, so you can start.
Thank you very much. Can I present the presentation over there? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, respected members of the committee, for your support. Thank you, Dr. Biondi, for agreeing to chair this meeting. And thank you, valued guests, for coming and sharing this important day with me. In this presentation, I will discuss some of the main points that I made to give you a sense of the overall contribution of the thesis. So first, starting from the title, Political Extremism and Argumentative Approach. If you do a quick search to find research that are made on extremism from perspective of argumentation theory, I'm afraid you will not find much. As far as I know, there are 2 papers in which I'm co-author of one of them. So, in a sense, the whole project is a contribution to argumentation theory. But of course, that does not mean there is not already a rich literature on extremism. Extremism has been studied by many disciplines, and it will be studied in the future because of how controversial, how impactful the phenomenon is. According to Qasim Qassam, an important voice in a philosophical approach to extremism, philosophy also is a latecomer to the game. He criticizes philosophers for not taking extremism seriously, and he argues for philosophy of extremism. He writes, extremism in its different forms is not a peripheral phenomenon in the world today. Extremist thinking, attitudes, and preoccupations are principally common. Extreme methods continue to be used in many places as a substitute of politics. And extremist ideologies are gaining popularity. The question is whether philosophy has anything to say about all this. There are, according to Qassam, questions about extremism that are plainly philosophical. The aim of this project is not to criticize anyone, but rather to encourage argumentation scholars to step in and start looking at extremism from the perspective of argumentation theory. And the project in itself is a proof that the rich interdisciplinary of argumentation theory, the nature of the rich interdisciplinary nature of the field itself, is well capable to do that job. Now, let me share some of the main points that I make in chapter 1. In chapter 1, among other points, I introduce a neutral definition of extremism, and I present a typology of extremism. So the question is, what is my definition and what is my typology? Well, I define political extremism as the following: a controversial political position aiming at a radical change of a political status quo, either by means of public argumentation or violence. So based on this definition, I present a typology. Civil versus uncivil extremism. Civil basically means peaceful, uncivil means violent. And I further subcategorize civil extremism into critical civil extremism and uncritical civil extremism. And I further classify violent extremism or uncivil extremism into justified violent extremism and unjustified violent extremism. Let's for a moment consider some leaders who have been accused to be extremists to somehow appreciate this typology, to somehow show the empirical relevancy of this typology. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Slobodan Milosevic, and Osama bin Laden. What was common among all these leaders, they wanted to affect a radical change in their society. However, different methods were used, as we all know. King abhorred violence. Mandela was willing to use it only when it was the only tool. For Milosevic, it was principal tool. For Osama bin Laden, it was virtually the only tool. Clearly, the outcomes of the first 2 leaders are positive. eradicating, reducing racism and apartheid, while the outcome of the last two leaders, were catastrophic. Bin Laden was the mastermind of 9/11, and Milosevic was accused of crime against humanity during Yugoslav war in the 1980s. So it's reasonable to classify types of extremism since it has different goals, different outcomes. It is achieved through different methods, and it's advanced by different leaders with different ideologies and mindsets. It's a bit hot and I'm stressed, so it's expected. So my approach to define political extremism neutrally and identify its types and subtypes, it is an attempt to present a novel definition via disassociation. First, I detach extremism from the negative core that is inaccurately, as I argue throughout the dissertation, attached to it. Then I attach a neutral value, which depending on specific details, could have positive and negative values and outcomes. Schiappa writes in explaining Parliament and Argumentative that disassociative definition is at work when a characteristic becomes the criterion for the correct use of the concept. So now I'm under the burden of proof to identify what are the criterion that I use for every type of extremism. To make it very simple, civil extremism, the criterion that I have to identify is what is employing civil means of advocacy, public argumentation, and civil extremism, violence. When you go down to subtypes of civil extremism, critical and uncritical extremism, what I have here as a criterion is principle of argumentative discussion. When you go down to look at the criterion for identifying justified violent extremism and unjustified violent extremism, the criterion that I argue for is principle of justified usage of violence. Unfortunately, as you can all appreciate the fact that I don't have time to go through the nuance of these definitions, but I hope they signal the novelty of the approach. We should remember that the dominant approach in the literature on extremism depicts extremism as essentially one type, unjustified violent extremism. So my first point is to push back against this approach, which I call essentialist approach to extremism, and I take issue with this essentialist approach because almost always depicts extremism in negative terms. Extremism by nature is a messy concept. To make the matter even worse, it's associated with other concepts, which are also messy and charged concepts, like radicalism, fundamentalism, fanaticism, terrorism. So, this brings me to one of the main points that I make in chapter 2, which is to disentangle this concept from each other. I do not have time to take you through the nuance of this disentanglement. However, I would make a couple of brief remarks to explain why radicalism and extremism are different. This is, to be honest, a challenging task, because if you remember in my definition, I use radical change. So the question is how radicalism is different from extremism. Well, if you look at Colin Beck, an author, established author in the field, in which other leading scholars like Hassan and Bartley built on his account, basically radicalism has two main features. One of them, using extra institutional means. The other one, changing socio-political status quos radically. So achieving those radical, or as he put it, structural change are one of the necessary conditions for radicalism. But with this definition of radicalism, extremism is different. Why? Because extremism can use both extra-institutional means as well as institutional means. However, in arguing and struggling for radical change and structural change, extremism might fail, and thus extremist ideas might start with individual arguers and small groups and stay there, thus fails to achieve structural changes. By advancing a neutral definition of extremism and arguing for typology of extremism, I'm not disregarding the legitimate concern in the literature about extremism, more specifically unjustified violent extremism. And that's why I have a whole chapter dedicated just for this type of extremism. In this chapter, I take ISIS. I look at ISIS, Daesh, Islamic State. They are as extremists to the degree that Al-Qaeda criticized them to be too extremist. So that's the threshold. So this chapter is a contribution to an area of study that, according to the prominent argumentation scholar Jane Goodwin, is understudied. And that area is a discourse that are produced by extremists. More specifically, argumentative analysis of those discourses. To do that, I provide an in-depth argumentative analysis of a famous speech by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the caliph of ISIS, titled A Message of the Mujahideen and Muslim Ummah in the Months of Ramadan. What I found is that the caliph masterfully uses what I call religious logic and appeal to sacred authority, along with other rhetorical strategies such as exhortation, stipulative definition, argument from analogy, and even sarcasm. Moving to a new chapter in which I suggest a new argument type to make sense of some aspects of political argumentation. Here in chapter 4, I make a case for expanding argument from authority and introducing argument from charisma. The main idea here is that there seems to be a power above and beyond the mere force of argument. And I try to theorize charisma as a way to make sense of this additional force, value. Building on Goodwin and Weber, I define argument from charismatic authority or argument through charismatic authority as the following. It is an argument that's neither based on power nor knowledge, but it is based on natural and inborn skills that make someone influential and persuasive in some unaccountable manner. In other words, the argument from charisma is argument from ethos in full force that's based on inborn rhetorical talents. Because a charismatic leader, in the eye of his audience, embodies or personifies the ideology, people, followers to be exact, see charismatic argument as an internal part of the arguer and see an arguer as an internal part of the charismatic argument. I call this phenomena personification of ideology. The main leader in focus in this chapter is Donald Trump, and the main speech that I studied is Save America's speech on January 6, 2021. As far as I know, in argumentation theory and argumentation scholarship, only Goodwin in a small paragraph mentions charisma. So this chapter again is an attempt to enrich and expand argumentation theory while using it to make sense of political argumentation in the context of extremism. Against the essentialist approach, which almost always defines extremism in negative terms, in chapter 5, I argue that extremist arguers could be, of course, blameworthy or vices, but, and this is controversial, but praiseworthy or virtues. The cases of civil extremism that I explore here are from suffragist and anti-slavery movements. And I also examine virtue and vices of justified violent extremism in the context of violent anti-colonial struggle. Here, I employ a pluralistic account to virtue study. The main reason to take this approach is that to be able to provide a comprehensive account of virtues and vices of extremists, a pluralistic account seems to be most appropriate. Moreover, the recent development of virtue study also moves towards a pluralistic approach, such as in works of key figures like Kassam and Butler. And even closer to home, a founding father of virtual argumentation theory, Andrew Aberdeen. In a recent exchange with him, he wrote, my more recent preference has been for Heather Bartley's pluralistic approach. Virtue can have good motives, good consequences, or both. A pluralistic approach to virtue, to put it simply, consider good motives, good actions, and good outcomes in this analysis. My analysis is in depth specifically to Aberdeen and Bartley. Aberdeen writes, where virtuous knowers are disposed to act in a way that leads to acquisition of true beliefs, virtuous arguers are disposed to spread true beliefs around. After consulting with Aberdeen on whether his definition can be read in consequentialist terms and whether a consequentialist reading of virtual argumentation is possible, he answered both inquiries affirmatively. And from Bartley, I borrow a framework of virtue which she labels as the motives, actions, and ends variety, which is, to put it simply, to be virtuous, one must have good motives, perform good actions, and be reliably successful at producing external goods. Thus, as a result of merging Aberdeen's spreading true belief, possibly as a telos of virtual argumentation theory, and Bartley's pluralistic framework, and there's an interesting part. Good motive can be translated into good motive to spread true belief. Good action can be translated into good argumentation, and successfully spreading true belief can be translated into good ends. Within this expanded version of virtual argumentation and pluralistic account to virtue, I found that sometimes an extremist arguer violates some argumentative virtue, yet resulting in spreading true belief. Or, as Bartley argues, in the context of Garrisonian anti-slavery movement, even though they, Garrisonians, were close-minded, which is violating of a virtue, they had libertary virtues. She writes, for disposition to be a libertary virtue, it must have libertary content, the agent must be aware of oppression, and must be motivated to resist it. Thus, I argued that virtual argumentation should consider both character-based virtues and end-based virtues. The key lesson here is that sometimes extremist arguers, with their steadfast mindset, progressive spirit, and praiseworthy sense of duty, can be crucial agent for socio-political changes in line with justice and freedom for all. Movements like abolitionism, suffragism, and anti-colonialism speaks to this judgment. Therefore, as Winthrop concludes, a society that tries to stamp out extremism is trying to stamp out its capacity to dream. Senator Barry Goldwater's famous saying is also relevant here. I will remind you that extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in pursuit of justice is not virtue. To conclude this presentation, allow me to summarize key contributions. First and foremost, introducing neutral definition of extremism and providing a typology and the context where in the literature the dominant view is extremism is bad, is negative. Disentangling several controversial terms such as extremism, terrorism, radicalism, fanaticism. Expanding literature on argument from authority by introducing argument from charisma. Advancing a pluralistic account of virtual argumentation in line with current development of virtue study. Argumentatively analyzing several influential case studies such as suffragism, abolitionism, and anti-colonialism. Identifying a pragmatic relationship between civility and extremism and provide a remedy, or also that remedy is a subject of future research. Identifying some of the challenges and lessons of extremism and more. In a sense, this project is stepping into unfamiliar territory. Therefore, some of the ideas presented here will be explored, expanded, even improved in future works. I hope other scholars will also step in and participate in advancing a richer argumentative analysis of extremism and other controversial phenomena. Thank you very much for your attention.